At Christmas dinner, my father looked me in the eye and called me a disgrace to the family. My stepmother laughed, my half-sister slid into my seat, and everyone else chose silence. They thought I would bow my head, stay quiet, and serve like dirt. But I smiled, I excused myself, and when I unlocked the one door they never expected me to touch, their perfect night began to crack. If you think that was the breaking point, stay with me, because what happened next turned their celebration into chaos and left them with nothing. The Christmas lights glittered against the frosted windows of the Donovan estate, reflecting in soft colors across the snow-covered lawn as I stepped out of the car. My heels crunched against the ice on the stone driveway, and for a moment I paused, staring at the house where I had grown up but never really belonged. From the outside, it looked like something out of a holiday magazine spread, white pillars wrapped in garlands, wreaths tied with red ribbons on every window, music drifting faintly from inside. Yet I knew that behind the glowing decorations and the smell of roasted turkey, there lived a coldness that no amount of tinsel could hide. The valet rushed toward me, opening the car door with a smile too quick, too polished. I handed him the keys and clutched my small clutch purse tighter than I meant to. I told myself it was just another dinner, another family performance meant to impress friends, business partners, and distant relatives who still believed in the myth of the perfect Donovan family. But my chest tightened as I moved up the stone steps. Each step felt heavier, as if I was walking into a theater where I had always been cast as the extra in the back. Inside, the foyer shimmered with chandeliers and the scent of pine. Guests in gowns and tailored suits laughed and clinked glasses. The sound of silverware against porcelain echoed faintly from the dining hall, and I recognized a dozen faces that had known me since childhood but never once had really looked at me. They smiled politely, eyes sliding past me to search for Michael or Sophie, the two children who had always mattered more. I walked slowly down the hall toward the dining room, heels tapping against the marble in a rhythm that steadied me. The long mahogany table gleamed under crystal lights, every chair filled except one. My father Richard stood at the head with a glass of wine, his tall frame imposing his hair silver under the glow. At his side, Elaine adjusted her pearl necklace with a practiced flick of her hand, her laugh sharp and rehearsed. Sophie leaned toward Michael, whispering something that made them both smirk. The chatter dipped as I entered, and though no one said it out loud, I felt the weight of their eyes. I smiled, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows, and walked toward the only empty chair near the middle of the table. Before I could pull it out, Richard's voice rang out deep and deliberate. There she is, the disgrace of the Donovan family. Why don't you just sit quietly and serve like the dirt you are? The words landed like shards of glass, sharp and cutting, but his tone was steady, almost casual, as if he was stating a fact known to everyone in the room. The silence that followed was worse than the insult itself. No one spoke. No one corrected him. Not a single person rose to my defense. Elaine's lips curled in satisfaction, her laugh a low hum that spread across the table like smoke. Sophie, dressed in a red silk dress, reached out with one manicured hand and dragged the chair in front of me toward herself. She lowered herself into it with elegance, smoothing her skirt and crossing her legs. She tilted her head toward me, her eyes gleaming with triumph. This seat looks better on me anyway. The cousins at the far end chuckled softly, quickly, masking it with coughs. Michael sipped his champagne and avoided my eyes, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. My mother had died long ago, and with her went the only chance I had for someone to shield me. I felt the burn of humiliation rise in my chest, but my face remained calm. I had been trained for this moment through decades of smaller insults, brushed aside accomplishments and invisible contributions. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I let my gaze travel slowly around the table. The glimmer of silverware, the sparkle of crystal glasses, the flicker of candles casting soft shadows on polished faces. Everyone was waiting, half curious, half entertained, to see what I would do. I smiled a smile colder than the snow outside and turned away. Without a word, I walked down the hall, my heels clicking against the polished wood, echoing in the sudden quiet. The corridor stretched before me, lined with family portraits I had stopped looking at years ago. Paintings of Michael shaking hands with governors, Sophie posing with celebrities, Richard cutting ribbons at corporate openings. My own face appeared only once in a photo taken when I was 8, standing stiff in a dress 2 sizes too big, eyes looking not at the camera but toward my brother. That was my role, even then background to someone else's spotlight. The sound of laughter resumed behind me, forced and brittle, as if nothing had happened. But I knew my absence had left a mark, one they would not acknowledge out loud. My father's voice rose again, telling a story about Michael's latest deal, and the room erupted in polite applause. I stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, a door most guests assumed led to a storage closet. My hand brushed the brass handle cool beneath my fingers. I carried a small key in my purse, a key my mother had given me years before she died. She had pressed it into my palm and whispered, "Never forget, Claire. This house hides more than it shows." I had never understood fully what she meant until much later. But tonight, as the humiliation burned quietly inside me, I felt the weight of her words settle into my bones. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling the faint scent of cedar from the garland overhead, and listened to the faint murmur of voices drifting from the dining room. Their laughter had already forgotten me, but I had not forgotten them. The handle was still under my palm, the metal warming slowly from my touch. I thought of my father's words echoing across the table. Disgrace. Dirt. Sit quietly and serve. I thought of Sophie stealing my seat with a smile. I thought of Elaine's laugh, polished and cruel. And I thought of Michael, eyes lowered, too weak or too selfish to speak a single word in my defense. I opened my eyes and straightened my shoulders. The night was far from over. The door before me was not just wood and brass. It was a boundary, a line I had never dared cross. Beyond it waited a choice that would change everything. My heels clicked once more as I shifted my weight, and the sound echoed like a drumbeat in the quiet hall. I slipped my hand into my clutch, feeling the small familiar shape of the key. My mother's key, the one no one else knew I had. I drew it out slowly, holding it in the soft light, the gold glinting against the dark wood. My breath came steady, now calm and deliberate. I knew what I had to do. I leaned closer, listening to the faint clink of glasses and the rise of music in the other room. They thought they had humiliated me into silence again, that I would retreat into invisibility as I always had. But tonight was different. Tonight I would not walk away quietly. I lifted the key toward the lock, but before I turned it, I let myself remember one last time the image of that table, my father's cold eyes, Sophie's smirk, Elaine's laughter, Michael's silence. I wanted to carry that memory with me, not as pain but as fuel. The brass lock gleamed in the dim light, waiting. I slid the key in and felt the tumblers shift under my hand. When I was 8 years old, I stood in front of the long oak table in the same dining room where tonight my father had called me dirt. Back then the table seemed endless, stretching from one side of the room to the other, polished so bright I could see my small reflection in its surface. I remember clutching the edge of the chair, my legs too short to touch the ground, and listening to Michael talk about his soccer game. Everyone laughed, applauded, praised him as though scoring a single goal made him destined for greatness. When I tried to tell them about the book report I had won a ribbon for, my father waved me off and told me to let my brother finish. That was the first time I realized words in my mouth carried less weight than words in his. My mother was still alive then. She had soft hands that smelled faintly of lavender and the only eyes in the room that ever truly looked at me. She would squeeze my shoulder under the table, an unspoken encouragement to keep speaking even if no one listened. But she passed away only a few years later, and with her gone, the thread of protection snapped. Richard remarried quickly. Elaine arrived in our house with polished nails, a wide smile, and a talent for making every conversation circle back to herself. She carried herself like someone who had been auditioning for high society all her life and finally landed the role. At first, I tried to please her. I helped carry her shopping bags, complimented her dresses, even offered to bake cookies with Sophie, her daughter from a previous marriage who was a few years younger than me. But nothing softened her. She wanted Michael in the spotlight, Sophie as the darling, and me somewhere out of frame. I remember one afternoon not long after Elaine moved in. We were decorating the Christmas tree, and I held up a glass ornament I had made at school. It was lopsided, painted unevenly, but it was mine. Elaine took one look and said it was sweet, then placed it on the backside of the tree where no one could see. She hung Sophie's store-bought angel front and center and told everyone how talented she was. My father nodded in agreement. Michael barely noticed, and I stood there feeling like my ornament had been shoved into the shadows, along with me. By the time I was 12, it was clear that Michael could do no wrong. He brought home a B on his report card, and my father slapped his back and said, "Boys will be boys." I brought home straight A's, and the paper was tucked into a drawer without comment. Sophie started ballet, and Elaine organized a recital in the living room so relatives could clap for her. When I tried to show them the essay I had published in the school paper, Elaine changed the subject to new curtains. I learned young that silence was safer than speaking. I also learned that attention in our house was currency, and Michael owned the bank. One Thanksgiving stands out sharper than the rest. I was 15, sitting across from Michael, who had just crashed the car he borrowed without permission. My father raged for an hour, pacing, gesturing wildly, Elaine holding her chest as if she might faint. When he finally calmed, he turned to me and demanded to know how I had let this happen. I stared at him stunned, reminding him I had been away at a debate competition 3 hours from home. He ignored me, repeating that as the older sister I should have kept him in line, though Michael was actually older. Elaine murmured that I should be more responsible. Sophie smirked into her cranberry sauce, and I sat there swallowing tears. The unfairness etched itself into my bones. I stopped expecting a recognition, stopped hoping someone would notice the quiet work I did. Instead, I focused on surviving. At school, I buried myself in books. The library became my sanctuary, the one place no one asked me to be less. I discovered I had a knack for numbers, for balancing equations and analyzing data. My teachers noticed even if my family did not. They encouraged me to apply for scholarships, to aim higher than the limits my father set. Michael was 2 years ahead of me, and by the time he graduated high school, he already had a desk waiting for him at Donovan Group. He strutted into that office with business cards printed with his name and the title of junior executive. I was still in college applications, filling them out alone at the kitchen table. I asked my father if he could look over my essays. He said, "You will figure it out, you always do." That was his way of dismissing me, of excusing his neglect by dressing it as confidence. Michael, meanwhile, had 3 tutors, 2 counselors, and a private coach for his interviews. I earned a scholarship to Columbia. I remember receiving the acceptance letter, my heart pounding with joy. I held it out to my father, waiting for a smile. He glanced at it, nodded once, and told me not to let it distract me from supporting Michael when he needed me. Elaine congratulated Sophie on getting into a local dance program the very same night and made a toast at dinner. No one toasted me. The summer before I left for college, I tried one last time to be included. I suggested we all go out to the lake together, like we used to when Mom was alive. Richard said he was too busy. Michael had a business dinner. Sophie had ballet practice. Elaine said maybe another time. I ended up driving to the lake alone, sitting on the dock until the sun went down, wondering how I could feel so invisible in a family that carried my own blood. College was liberation and loneliness at once. I was free from the daily reminders that I was unwanted, but I carried the wound with me. I threw myself into classes, staying late in the library, working part-time jobs to cover what scholarships did not. While my peers went home for weekends, I stayed behind. Going back to the Donovan estate only reminded me of where I stood. At Columbia, I began to understand just how sharp my mind could be when it was not being dulled by dismissal. Professors encouraged me to speak up. Classmates turned to me for help in group projects. It was intoxicating and heartbreaking to see strangers value what my own father had discarded. Michael came to visit once, striding across campus as though he owned it. He introduced himself to my friends as a business executive, puffing up his chest. Later, he pulled me aside and told me to remember that everything I was learning would be useful for supporting Donovan Group one day. Not for me, for him. His arrogance pressed down on me like a hand on my shoulder, forcing me lower. I nodded, but inside I swore that one day I would never be anyone's shadow again. Sophomore year, I won a prize for an economics paper on corporate restructuring. I sent a copy to my father, hoping he might finally acknowledge my work. Weeks later, I received a short reply. "Good job. Remember your brother's upcoming presentation? He needs help with his slides." I stared at that message until the words blurred. Good job was as much as he could muster for me, yet his true focus was always Michael. By the time I graduated, I had learned not to expect applause from home. I walked across the stage, my gown swishing against my ankles, the crowd roaring for graduates. I searched the audience and saw no familiar faces. Richard was attending a gala with Michael. Elaine had taken Sophie on vacation. No one came for me. I smiled for the cameras anyway, diploma in hand, and promised myself I would build a life that no one could erase. Years later, when my father called me dirt at the Christmas table, the sting carried all those memories with it. The nights alone in the library, the ignored ribbons, the lopsided ornament hidden on the back of the tree, the endless comparisons to siblings who shone brighter only because I had been forced into the shadows. What they did not realize was that every slight had hardened me, every dismissal had sharpened me. I was no longer the girl clinging to a chair at 8 years old, desperate to be heard. I was a woman who had learned the value of silence, who understood how power often came not from being seen, but from knowing when to wait. As I stood in that hallway with my mother's key in my hand, the echoes of my childhood pulsed through me. They thought I was still that invisible girl, They had no idea what I had become. The summer of 2012 still burns in my memory like a fever. I had just finished graduate school, juggling odd jobs to cover the pieces of tuition that my scholarship did not, when the call came. It was Michael, his voice strained and clipped, asking if I could come by the office. He never called me unless he needed something, and this time I could hear the panic hidden beneath his practiced tone. I remember glancing at the clock in my small apartment, the city buzzing outside and feeling that familiar tug of responsibility. No matter how many times I promised myself I was done rescuing him, I always seemed to answer. When I arrived at Donovan Group's headquarters in Manhattan, the lobby was quieter than I remembered. The receptionist avoided eye contact, the phones barely rang. The hum of energy that usually filled a corporate building was gone, replaced with a silence that felt like dread. Michael was waiting in the conference room, pacing his tie loosened, his forehead damp with sweat. He looked smaller somehow, though he tried to keep his usual swagger. "We are fine," he insisted the moment I walked in. "Just a few hiccups." But the papers strewn across the table told another story. Bills, overdue contracts falling through vendors demanding payment. The company was hemorrhaging money. I pulled the spreadsheets toward me and felt my pulse quicken. Years of classes and internships had trained my eyes to see the story hidden in numbers. I traced the patterns, the unnecessary expenses, the duplicate vendors charging twice for the same service, the bloated budgets left unchecked. It was worse than I expected. If things continued, the company would collapse in a matter of weeks. Michael sat across from me, chewing on the end of a pen, his leg bouncing under the table. "Dad thinks we can just ride it out," he muttered, as though repeating a prayer. "Elaine says we just need good press." But I knew hope and headlines would not stop creditors from knocking. I spent days in that conference room, fueled by bitter coffee and sheer determination. I built emergency audits, called vendors myself, negotiated delays, and redrafted contracts. I reached out to a handful of investors I had met through seminars and workshops, people who respected my diligence even if they barely knew my family name. One by one, they agreed to meet. I promised them restructuring, a path back to solvency, and for some reason they believed me. Perhaps it was because I spoke plainly, without the puffed-up confidence Michael wielded. Perhaps it was because I had nothing to lose. Those weeks blurred into one long stretch of phone calls, spreadsheets, and tense board meetings where my presence was barely acknowledged. Michael stood at the front with his practiced grin while I sat quietly at the side, sliding notes to him under the table, whispering the answers he pretended to know. I did not mind in the moment. All that mattered was survival. When the contracts were signed and the money arrived, payroll was saved. The lights stayed on. The staff returned from the brink of leaving. Relief washed through the building like oxygen. And then came the cameras. I remember standing near the elevator, exhausted, my blazer wrinkled, my hair pulled back hastily when a reporter stopped Michael in the lobby. They wanted a quote about how he had steered the company through its darkest storm. Michael smiled, squared his shoulders, and delivered the lines I had written for him. The article appeared days later with his photograph plastered across the page, the headline praising the young CEO who had rescued his father's legacy. My name was nowhere to be found. I sat at my kitchen table with the paper spread out before me. My hands trembled not from anger but from the clarity of realization. I was invisible again, my work consumed by someone else's spotlight. Richard called that night not to thank me, but to praise Michael for his leadership. I listened in silence, the phone pressed to my ear, my stomach hollow. A week later, I ran into Thomas Reed, our family lawyer, outside the courthouse downtown. He was carrying a stack of files, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He greeted me warmly, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You know, Claire, you have more power in this family than they admit. Your mother left you her shares. They cannot close certain deals without your signature." The words startled me. I had known vaguely about inheritance, but never the details. Thomas explained that my mother, perhaps foreseeing the imbalance, had left a clause ensuring my consent was required for major corporate decisions. He told me to keep it in mind to protect myself. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his words echoing in my mind. Power. It was a foreign word in connection to me. I had always been the helper, the fixer in the shadows. To imagine that I held something tangible, something they could not take away, was both thrilling and terrifying. Meanwhile, Michael basked in the glow of public praise. He appeared on business panels, shook hands with governors, gave speeches about resilience. He wore suits I had helped him pick out, quoting strategies I had written, smiling as though he had crafted them himself. Richard beamed beside him, Elaine glowing with pride, Sophie clapping from the front row. I stayed home invisible, reading the articles in silence. One evening I confronted Michael privately. I told him it was wrong to take credit for what he had not done. He laughed, poured himself a drink, and said no one cares who does the work. They only care who signs the papers. He patted my shoulder and added that I should be grateful to be useful. The words stung not because they were surprising, but because they were true in our world. Credit belonged to the face, not the hands. And in our family, Michael would always be the face. I kept helping for a while. I drafted reports, prepared him for board meetings, coached him before investor calls. Each time he nodded, smiled, and thanked me privately, then stood in front of others as if the ideas had sprung from his own mind. It was a pattern I knew too well. But slowly something inside me shifted. I stopped correcting his mistakes before he made them. I stopped offering solutions before he asked. I watched as he stumbled in meetings, repeating buzzwords without depth, promising results he could not deliver. I stayed silent. It was not malice. It was clarity. I realized that saving him meant erasing myself. The board noticed cracks. Whispers began among employees. Vendors grew cautious. Michael still held the title, but the weight of it began to strain him. I stepped back further, focusing instead on my own small ventures. I opened an LLC with a discreet name, invested in a handful of startups others dismissed, and poured my energy into places where my efforts would bear my own name. Yet, even as I built my separate world, the memory of that summer remained etched in me. The long hours in the conference room, the thrill of pulling the sinking ship upright, the bitterness of watching someone else hoist the flag of victory. It was a lesson I carried forward. Years later, when my father insulted me at the Christmas table, those memories surged back. They had called me dirt, invisible, irrelevant. But I remembered saving their empire when they were too blind to see the cracks. I remembered the truth hidden behind Michael's polished smile, and I remembered Thomas Reed's quiet warning, the reminder that I still held a key no one could take. I pressed my hand against the door at the end of the hallway that night and thought of all of it. The silence, the labor, the invisibility, the buried inheritance. The door was not just a door. It was a symbol of everything they tried to lock away. And as my fingers curled around the brass handle, I knew the story was not finished. The months after the crisis of 2012 carried an odd stillness, like the quiet that follows a storm. On the surface, the Donovan Group looked steady again. Michael's photo still appearing in glossy magazines and Richard boasting to anyone who would listen that his son had inherited his business sense. But behind the polished facade, cracks kept forming. I noticed them every time I slipped into the office for a quiet meeting with Thomas Reed or whenever I overheard conversations in hushed tones by the elevators. I had begun to keep a journal, then nothing elaborate, just a leather notebook where I scribbled numbers, names, and my own thoughts late at night. It was the only place I allowed myself to write down the truth. Page after page filled with accounts of missed payments, bloated deals Michael bragged about that never materialized, and the steady erosion of trust from vendors who once praised the Donovan family name. I never showed it to anyone, but writing it grounded me. It reminded me that my perception was not paranoia. By the time 2015 arrived, Richard's health was starting to falter. His hair had thinned, his voice grew raspier, and though he insisted on attending every board meeting, his presence had become more symbolic than functional. Elaine hovered closer than ever, her hand on his arm, her laugh filling the silence whenever his cough interrupted a sentence. Michael and Sophie flanked him like trophies, basking in the glow of proximity. I stayed in the back, observing. My role had not changed in their eyes, but inside me something was shifting. That summer I received a call from Ruth Klein, one of the vendors I had helped negotiate with years before. Her voice was tight with worry. Claire, I wanted to reach out because Michael just canceled our contract with no notice. He said the company was going in another direction. We have employees depending on this work. I assured her I would look into it, though I knew Michael's impulsive decisions rarely got reversed. Later that week, I confronted him in his office. The blinds were half closed, the desk cluttered with unopened files, his attention fixed on his phone. He smirked when I brought up Ruth. Business is business, he said casually. If they can't keep up, they don't deserve the contract. I reminded him that Ruth had kept us afloat when no one else would touch us, that her faith had saved jobs. He shrugged, pouring himself a drink, and told me sentiment had no place in business. Walking out of that office, I felt a heaviness settle into me. It was not just about Ruth. It was about every small betrayal accumulating like dust in corners, unnoticed until it suffocates. I realized then that I could no longer just quietly clean up after them. Their carelessness was not just foolish, it was cruel. At the same time, whispers began to swirl about Richard's will. Elaine dropped hints at dinners. Sophie giggled about future control, and Michael grew more arrogant, as though the throne had already been promised. I kept silent, though Thomas Reed had quietly confirmed what I already suspected. My mother's clause still stood. My signature was required for major structural changes, and Elaine knew it. One afternoon, Thomas invited me to his office, a modest space lined with old law books and the faint smell of leather polish. He poured me coffee and slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents outlining the family trust shares and voting rights. He pointed to a line highlighted in yellow. "This gives you veto power, Claire. They cannot move forward on mergers or major acquisitions without you. Do not forget that." I stared at the page, the weight of it pressing into me. I asked him why my father had never acknowledged it. Thomas sighed. "Your father believes power belongs to the heir he chose, not the one he overlooked. He will never admit that your mother outmaneuvered him." That night I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, the noise of traffic drifting up like a heartbeat. For the first time, I let myself imagine what it would mean to use that power. Not for vengeance, not yet, but for protection. Protection of myself, of the people like Ruth who had stood by me, of the silent workers whose names would never appear in headlines. Still, I kept quiet. Years of conditioning held me in place. My father's disapproving eyes, Elaine's sharp laughter, Sophie's smirks, Michael's entitlement. They had all taught me that my place was in the shadows. Yet I also knew shadows could conceal movement. By 2017, Richard's decline was undeniable. He suffered a minor stroke that autumn, and for weeks he shuffled between the hospital and home, his presence in the office reduced to occasional phone calls. Michael seized the opportunity, declaring himself interim leader, his speeches growing more grandiose by the day. Elaine orchestrated dinners where she paraded him as the savior of the family, legacy Sophie trailing behind with adoration. The board nodded politely, but I noticed the flicker of doubt in their eyes. I noticed, too, how often they glanced at me when Michael's numbers failed to add up. They remembered the summer of 2012, even if no one spoke it aloud. They knew who had really pulled the company back then. During those months, I quietly built my own foundation. I invested in small businesses across Brooklyn, startups ignored by venture capitalists, women-led initiatives that reminded me of myself. I sat in diners at midnight listening to dreams sketched on napkins, and I wrote checks under the name of Harbor 12 Holdings. It was quiet work and visible, but it gave me a sense of purpose beyond the Donovan name. At family dinners, the pattern remained unchanged. Michael boasted. Sophie gossiped. Elaine sneered. Richard stayed silent, and I sat listening invisible. One evening in December, while the house glowed with Christmas lights, Elaine leaned across the table and whispered so only I could hear. "Do not forget your place, Claire. This family has no patience for those who think they deserve more than they are given." Her words should have crushed me, but instead they lit something deep inside. I smiled politely, sipped my wine, and said nothing. In my mind, I was already planning. By 2019, Richard's death was not a shock, though it still hollowed me out. The funeral was lavish, filled with business partners and political figures, a performance more than a farewell. Michael delivered the eulogy. Elaine wept dramatically. Sophie clung to her mother's arm. I stood quietly by the casket, tracing the wood with my fingertips, thinking only of my mother. She had known this day would come. She had left me the key, both literal and legal. After the burial, the board convened privately. I was not invited, though. I managed to learn the outcome. Michael was officially appointed CEO, with Elaine and Sophie celebrating like royalty. My name appeared only in the fine print, the silent partner with veto rights no one wanted to acknowledge. That night, I drove aimlessly through the city, the lights blurring through my tears. Grief for my father mixed with a bitter clarity. He had never seen me, not really. He had died believing Michael was the future and I was the shadow. But grief did not paralyze me. It sharpened me. I returned to my small apartment and opened my mother's jewelry box, the one I had carried since her passing. Inside, beneath a tangle of necklaces, was the brass key she had given me. I held it in my palm, feeling its cool weight. My mother knew. She had seen me in ways no one else had. She had left me tools, reminders that invisibility could be a choice rather than a sentence. From that night on, I began to watch more carefully. Michael's boasts grew reckless. He pushed for expansions the company could not afford. Elaine pressured the board to approve lavish spending. Sophie strutted through events as though she owned the world. I attended every meeting, saying little but noting everything. My journal is filled with dates, figures, and moments. Each entry was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of inevitable collapse. The stage was setting itself. All I had to do was wait. The first time I saw Charlotte Fairchild's name, it was not in a social column or on Michael's arm at a gala. It was in a contract draft that arrived by mistake in my email inbox. The subject line was bland, signature confirmation request, the kind of administrative message I nearly deleted without opening. But something made me pause. When I clicked it open, I found myself staring at a long thread of correspondence, much of it between Michael Elaine and attorneys from the Fairchild Group. Buried deep in the thread was a line that made my pulse quicken. Atlas's future growth plan must be signed off by both the CEO and the co-founder. The co-founder was not Michael, it was me. For a long moment I sat frozen at my desk, the glow of my laptop reflecting off the window behind me. Outside, New York was loud as ever, horns blaring, people rushing past on the street, lives unfolding. Inside, everything was still, my name in black and white, tethered to a deal Michael had not even told me about. I called Thomas Reed immediately. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm, as though he had been expecting me. "Yes, Claire," he said, "I was planning to brief you. The Fairchilds did their homework. They know your role even if your family pretends otherwise." His words steadied me. At least someone outside the Donovan walls understood. Thomas explained that Warren Fairchild was no fool. He had spent decades investing in companies on the brink, swooping in with capital while securing control. He was ruthless but strategic. He knew Michael was reckless and he wanted a safeguard. That safeguard was me. Later that evening, I Googled Charlotte Fairchild. Photographs filled the screen. She was striking, polished, in every image smiling beside politicians, stepping out of black cars in designer gowns. Her father Warren appeared at her side often, his expression unreadable, his power radiating even through pixels. Articles called Charlotte a philanthropist and heiress, a brilliant mind with a background in economics. But I knew how these things worked. She was leveraged. It did not take long for Michael to announce his engagement. The news broke in the Wall Street Journal first, then cascaded across tabloids and business magazines. Headlines called it a merger of legacies, a fairy tale match. Photographs of them together appeared overnight, staged but convincing. Michael grinning, Charlotte glowing, Elaine and Sophie hovering nearby as though they too had won. No one called me. No one thought to include me in their charade. I learned about it the way strangers did, by reading the headlines. When I finally saw Michael face to face, it was at a dinner staged for family and close partners. The table stretched the length of a hotel ballroom, chandeliers glittering above candles flickering on polished silver. Elaine greeted me with a smile too sharp to be warm. Sophie kissed my cheek, her perfume cloying her eyes, dancing with mockery. Michael introduced me to Charlotte with casual indifference. "This is my sister Claire. She keeps things running in the background." Charlotte's handshake was cool, her smile precise, but her eyes, sharp and calculating, told me everything. She knew who I was. She knew what I held. When dinner ended, Warren Fairchild approached me. He was tall, his presence filling the space around him like a tide. His voice was low, deliberate. "We are counting on your cooperation," he said. It was not a request, it was a warning. I nodded politely, but inside I felt something shift. For years I had been overlooked, humiliated, erased. Now here stood a man of power acknowledging me not for who I was, but for what I controlled. It was not respect, but it was recognition. Michael cornered me near the exit as I reached for my coat. His voice was tight, his smile brittle. "Don't make this difficult, Claire. It is just a formality. We need this deal." He said it as though I were a child being asked to behave at a party. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not a leader but the same boy who had crashed his bike and begged me not to tell Dad. Only now the stakes were higher. In the weeks that followed, the pressure grew. Documents appeared in my inbox, unsigned pages waiting for my consent. Calls came from assistants asking for confirmation. Elaine dropped remarks at dinners about loyalty and family duty. Sophie rolled her eyes whenever I hesitated to answer. Michael pretended patience, but I could see his temper fraying. Then came the email. Charlotte had written to Michael careless, perhaps confident that I would never see it. "Once she signs, we are done babysitting her. She will be irrelevant." The words seared into me. Not gratitude, not even tolerance. Just dismissal, planned and deliberate. I sat in my apartment that night, the city lights flickering against the window pane, staring at the email. My chest tightened, my hands shook, and then suddenly I laughed. A quiet, bitter laugh that startled even me. They thought they had won. They thought I would sign and fade into the background, erased once and for all. They had no idea what they had just set in motion. I printed the email and slipped it into my journal, sliding the page between notes and figures I had collected for years. Then I called Thomas. "Hold everything I instructed. Do not let them close a single door without me." That night I dreamed of my mother. She was standing in the old garden sunlight slanting across her shoulders, her face calm. She did not speak, but in the dream she pressed the brass key into my palm again, her fingers warm around mine. I woke with the image burning in my mind. The next morning I dressed with care. A dark blazer, my hair pulled back, flats that made no noise against the marble floors of the Donovan offices. Michael was already inside the boardroom when I arrived, pacing, his phone buzzing constantly. He glanced up, eyes narrowing, and asked if I had brought the signed pages. I set my bag down slowly, deliberately. "Not yet," I said. His jaw clenched. He started to speak, but I held up a hand. "Not yet." The silence that followed was thick. Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. Sophie shifted uncomfortably. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. And Warren, who had been watching from the far end of the room, leaned back in his chair, studying me. For once, I let the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel it, the uncertainty, the cracks in their carefully staged performance. Later that evening, I walked alone through Central Park, the snow crunching under my boots, the air sharp against my face. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my pocket, but I ignored it. Each call, each message, was another attempt to corral me back into the shadows. But I was done being invisible. I stopped near a bench where my mother used to sit with me on Sunday afternoons. I could almost hear her voice, soft but firm, reminding me that dignity was not something anyone could grant or take away. It was something you carried quietly even when no one noticed. Especially then. I breathed deeply, letting the cold fill my lungs, and knew the course was set. I would not sign. I would not surrender. And when the time came when they least expected it, I would unlock the door they had tried so hard to keep closed. The days after I refused to sign stretched out like a taut string, each hour vibrating with pressure but never snapping. Messages flooded my phone, polite at first, then demanding. Michael's tone shifted from cheerful persuasion to sharp-edged threats. Elaine called more than once, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy as she reminded me that family unity was fragile, that appearances mattered, that I would not want to be remembered as the daughter who ruined everything. Sophie left a single voicemail, her words blunt. "Stop playing games, Claire. We all know you are not important. Just sign and disappear." I saved every message, forwarding them quietly to a secure email I kept only for myself. It was not about evidence yet. It was about preserving the truth, a habit I had learned after too many years of being erased. The board convened a week later, and for the first time I walked into the meeting without my usual hesitation. The long table gleamed under recessed lights, leather chairs filled with men and women in tailored suits. Michael stood at the head, his smile too wide, his eyes strained. He gestured at me as if presenting a reluctant ally. "Claire will be finalizing her approval today," he announced. But his voice wavered. I took my seat at the far end and opened my folder. The unsigned papers rested on top, pristine, untouched. The meeting stretched for hours. Presentations charts, endless slides crafted to impress Warren Fairchild, who sat silently, his expression unreadable. Charlotte chimed in occasionally, her voice polished, rehearsed. Speaking of vision and partnership, Elaine leaned close to whisper encouragement into Michael's ear as though he were still a boy at a school recital. Sophie scrolled through her phone, only looking up when applause rippled through the room. When the time came, Michael slid the documents toward me. His hand trembled just slightly. Everyone's eyes turned. I picked up the pen, feeling the weight of it between my fingers. The silence was heavy. Then I set the pen down again and folded my hands. "Not yet," I said quietly. The ripple that moved through the room was almost physical. Michael flushed deep red, his voice breaking as he demanded to know what else I wanted. Elaine stiffened. Charlotte's jaw tightened. Warren's eyes sharpened with interest. I simply closed my folder and rose. The meeting ended in chaos, voices overlapping, chairs scraping. But I walked out calm, my heels striking the marble like a metronome. That night, sitting in my apartment, I realized I had crossed an invisible line. They had always believed I could be coerced with shame, but now they saw I was capable of something else, resistance. I began to prepare in earnest. I reviewed every connection I had built quietly over the years. The startups I had funded, the founders who still texted me updates, the vendors who trusted me long after Michael's arrogance had burned bridges. My web was not loud or visible, but it was sturdy. One evening, I met with Maya and Louis, the first pair of entrepreneurs I had ever backed. We sat in a small cafe in Brooklyn, their hands still ink-stained from sketching on whiteboards. They spoke of expansion, of cautious optimism. I listened, then asked them a simple question. "If Atlas were to approach you tomorrow, would you consider exclusivity?" Maya frowned. Louis shook his head. "Only if you told us it was safe. Otherwise, we trust you." Their words warmed me more than the coffee in my cup. It was not about power in the way my family understood it. It was about trust earned quietly, steadily. I carried that trust with me like armor. At another meeting, this time in a warehouse-turned-office, Ruth greeted me with a hug. She had recovered from Michael's betrayal, her company thriving again thanks to a small loan I had extended when she was at her lowest. She told me she still remembered the night I called to check on her payroll, a detail she said no one else had ever cared about. That memory was worth more than any boardroom applause. Piece by piece, I saw how my invisibility had given me freedom. While they laughed at me, dismissed me, mocked me at dinners, I had been building something they could not touch. But invisibility was not enough anymore. I needed to prepare for the moment when everything would crack open. It came sooner than I expected. Early one morning, as snow blanketed the city, I received an email from Thomas Reed. The subject line was blunt. Emergency board vote scheduled. The Fairchild deal was collapsing. Michael had promised more than he could deliver, and Warren was losing patience. I arrived at the office that afternoon, the halls buzzing with tension. Assistants whispered doors shut quickly when I passed. In the boardroom, Michael was pale, his tie askew, his hands gripping the table. He tried to rally support, blaming market fluctuations, painting himself as the victim of bad timing. But Warren was unmoved. His voice cut through the excuses. "I do not invest in children who gamble with legacies." The words hung in the air like thunder. Michael stammered. Elaine pleaded. Sophie tried to interject with some rehearsed defense. None of it mattered. Warren stood, straightened his cuffs, and announced his withdrawal. The Fairchild capital was gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael turned to me, then desperation in his eyes. "Claire, you have to fix this. You always fix this." The irony of his words nearly broke me. Always. Invisible when things went well, summoned when disaster struck. I looked around the table at the faces watching me. Some pitied me, others waited curious. I thought of the years of humiliation, of being called dirt, of Sophie stealing my chair at Christmas, of Elaine's whispers. I thought of my father's silence, of every time he chose Michael's failures over my victories. I stood slowly gathering my folder. "Not this time," I said. Michael's face contorted with rage. "You would destroy your own family," he shouted. But I walked out, leaving his words echoing in the boardroom. Outside, the winter air hit my face like ice, sharp and clean. My breath clouded in front of me as I pulled my coat tighter. For the first time in years, I felt light. They thought I had trapped myself by refusing to sign. They thought I was cornered. They had no idea I was already free. That night, I opened my journal again, flipping through years of notes, reminders and figures. Every entry was a map of their downfall. I did not need to destroy them. They had already done that themselves. All I had to do was stop saving them. As I set the journal aside, my phone buzzed with another desperate message from Michael. I let it ring, the sound fading into the quiet of my apartment. The city hummed beyond my window, alive and indifferent. The stage was ready. The only thing left was timing. The weeks after Warren Fairchild walked out of the boardroom were filled with chaos that buzzed through the Donovan group like a swarm of angry bees. Phones rang constantly, reporters camped outside the building, and rumors spread faster than anyone could contain them. Vendors demanded reassurances, investors pulled their commitments, and employees whispered in the hallways about what would happen next. Michael moved through the storm with the wild energy of a gambler doubling down after a loss. He hosted frantic meetings, made promises he could not keep, and shouted into his phone until his voice cracked. I kept my distance, showing up when required but never volunteering to rescue him. The instinct was still there, the part of me that had always stepped in when disaster loomed, but I forced myself to remain still. Each time I felt the urge, I remembered the Christmas dinner, the sound of my father's voice calling me dirt, the echo of Sophie's laughter. I reminded myself that every time I saved them, I erased myself. Still, I could not ignore the ripple effects entirely. The businesses I had backed privately began to feel Atlas's shadow pressing in. Founders called me late at night, asking if they should accept sudden offers from Michael's people. They trusted me, not him, and their loyalty both strengthened me and frightened me. It meant my choices were no longer just about me. One cold January morning, I met with Ahmed, a wiry man with quick eyes who had built a payment platform for tradespeople. We sat at a small diner near the river, steam rising from our coffee cups. He leaned across the table and whispered, "Atlas offered us exclusivity for 12 months. They want us to shut out the community banks." I asked him what he wanted. He shrugged. "We will survive either way, but I would rather not sell out people who built this with me." "What do you think, Claire?" The question struck me. What do you think, Claire? It was so simple, yet it carried weight I was unaccustomed to. My opinion mattered. My decision could alter the course of his company. I told him the truth. Put the community banks first. Atlas will try to bully, but if they really want speed, they can come back with fair terms. He nodded, slowly, relief washing across his face. That was when I realized how far my influence had reached, not through titles or headlines, but through quiet consistency. Meanwhile, Sophie seemed to blossom in the chaos, as though the storm energized her. She appeared at charity galas flashing her smile, pretending nothing was wrong. Elaine doubled her efforts to project control, her pearls glittering as she delivered sound bites to the press. Michael, however, began to crack. His suits looked rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, his voice desperate. One evening, he appeared at my apartment unannounced, pounding on the door until I opened it. His face was pale, his tie loosened, his hands shaking. "You have to help me, Claire. If you do not, everything collapses." I stood in the doorway, the memory of years of dismissal pressing against my chest. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We are family." The word stung. Family. For him it meant leverage, not loyalty. I stepped back, my voice steady. "You made your choices, Michael. Now you live with them." His face twisted with fury, then collapsed into something like fear. He muttered a curse under his breath and stormed down the hall. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. That night I wrote for hours in my journal. I traced the path of our family legacy, from my father's pride to Michael's recklessness, to my mother's quiet foresight. Each page became a reminder that I was not powerless, that I had already built a lattice stronger than their empire. Still, I felt the tension mounting like a drumbeat. Something was coming. It arrived in the form of a dinner invitation. Elaine sent it, her handwriting elegant, her words precise. A family gathering, she wrote, to celebrate unity in difficult times. I almost laughed when I read it. Unity had never existed in our family-only performance, but I knew I had to go. The restaurant was one my father had loved, an old place with dark wood paneling and chandeliers that had dimmed over decades. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of memory pressing down. My father's voice echoed in my mind, telling me to sit quietly, to serve, to accept invisibility. The long table gleamed with polished silverware. Michael sat at the head now, flanked by Elaine and Sophie. Charlotte was there too, her smile tight, her eyes calculating. Warren did not come. His absence spoke louder than words. As I took my seat near the end of the table, I felt every gaze. The meal unfolded with forced laughter, Michael recounting exaggerated tales of resilience, Elaine nodding proudly, Sophie chiming in with shallow jokes. When the chatter dipped, Elaine leaned toward me. Her perfume was sharp, suffocating. "Keep your head down, Claire," she murmured, her voice low. "Do not ruin this for everyone." I lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip, offering no reply. My silence unnerved her more than words could. When dessert arrived, Michael raised his glass. To the family, he declared, his voice trembling slightly. Everyone echoed, the toast glasses clinking. I raised mine too, though my thoughts were elsewhere. My family had never protected me. My family used me. My loyalty lay elsewhere now, with those who trusted me, with the quiet empire I had built in shadows. As the dinner ended, I stood smoothing my blazer. Michael looked up, his eyes searching mine. There was a flicker of something I had not seen before. Not arrogance, not anger, fear. He sensed it too. The shift, the inevitability. I left the restaurant with the cold air biting my face, the city alive around me. The night felt electric, charged with the weight of everything unspoken. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, knowing the final act was drawing closer. The balance of power had already shifted. They just had not realized it yet. The night before the Christmas dinner felt heavier than any other. Snow drifted past my apartment window in slow spirals, catching the glow of streetlights and scattering it across the room. I sat at my desk with a stack of papers spread before me, though my eyes kept sliding away from the words. My journal lay open, pages crowded with notes from years of silence and survival. Names, dates, moments of cruelty, evidence of neglect. It was all there, stitched together in black ink like a record of what they had chosen to forget. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The memory of my father's voice still rang in me, sharp as broken glass. Sit quietly and serve like dirt. That single sentence had carried the weight of every insult before it. It was not new, not shocking, but spoken out loud at a table filled with witnesses, it had marked something final. The mask had dropped. The family no longer pretended to see me as anything more than a servant to their comfort. I thought of my mother then, her soft hands guiding me through childhood, her whispered reminders that worth was not granted by applause but by quiet resilience. She had known this day would come. That was why she left me the key. That was why she fought to place my signature into the legal bones of the company. She had not been protecting the Donovan legacy. She had been protecting me. The next morning I dressed slowly, deliberately. A simple black dress, a wool coat, boots that held steady against the ice. I tied my hair back, not for vanity, but for focus. The mirror reflected a face both familiar and strange. I saw the girl who once sat invisible at family dinners, but I also saw the woman who had walked away from boardrooms with the power to end empires. The Donovan estate glowed against the snow when I arrived, every window lit, wreaths and ribbons adorning the gates. Valets hurried to take coats. Guests swept inside with laughter trailing behind them. From a distance it looked perfect, but I knew better. Inside, the air was thick with pine and roasting meat. The long dining room sparkled under chandeliers, silver-polished until it gleamed, glasses lined like soldiers awaiting command. At the head of the table, Michael stood tall, a smile plastered across his face, though his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. Elaine fluttered nearby, pearls gleaming, voices rising in bright bursts of false cheer. Sophie leaned against her chair, scrolling on her phone until she saw me enter. She smirked, her red lips curling like a blade. I walked the length of the table, my heels echoing against the floor, each step measured. Guests greeted me politely but distantly, their gazes sliding away quickly. My seat, as expected, was not at the main table but near the side, tucked awkwardly by the swinging kitchen door. The linen on the chair was wrinkled, the silverware mismatched. I sat slowly, folding my hands in my lap, letting the humiliation settle into the silence. The conversation swelled around me. Laughter from distant cousins, the clinking of glasses, Sophie's bright giggle cutting through the noise. Then it happened, sharp and deliberate. My father's voice strong despite his failing health slicing across the table. "She does not run anything. She should sit quietly and serve like dirt." The words froze the room for a moment. Then Elaine laughed, sharp and triumphant. Sophie slid into the chair meant for me, her movements graceful, smug. She crossed her legs, adjusted her dress, and looked at me with a sparkle of victory. Around them, cousins smirked. Some chuckled softly, others avoided my eyes. Not one spoke up, not one offered even the smallest defense. My pulse thudded in my ears, but my face remained calm. I lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip. The humiliation pressed against me, hot and suffocating, but beneath it there was something stronger, resolve. I let my gaze travel around the table, memorizing every detail. My father's cold eyes, Elaine's smug grin, Sophie's triumphant smirk, Michael's forced composure, the nervous laughter of relatives pretending nothing had happened. I wanted to engrave it all into memory, not as pain but as fuel. After a long pause, I set my glass down and smiled. It was not forced. It was not warm. It was the kind of smile that comes when the final piece of a puzzle slides into place. Then I stood, smoothed my coat, and murmured a polite excuse. I walked the hall slowly, my heels striking the polished wood, the echo carrying behind me. Portraits of Donovans lined the walls, each frame capturing triumphs and milestones I had never been part of. My father shaking hands with governors, Michael cutting ribbons, Sophie posing with celebrities. Only one photograph bore my face, a child barely visible in the background. I reached the door at the end of the hall, the one most people ignored. My hand brushed the brass handle, cool and familiar. I slipped the small key from my purse, the one my mother had pressed into my palm years ago. For a moment I held it in my hand, feeling its weight, hearing her voice whisper again. "Never forget, Claire, this house hides more than it shows." Behind me the laughter rose again, brittle and hollow. They thought I had left to lick my wounds, to cry in silence, as always. They had no idea. I leaned closer, slid the key into the lock and turned it slowly. The tumblers shifted with a soft click, the sound barely audible above the noise from the dining room. The door creaked open and cold air brushed my face. Inside was darkness, a storage room untouched for years. But it was more than storage. It connected to the estate's old servant corridors, hallways that wound beneath the house, hidden from the guests who sipped wine and toasted false unity upstairs. My mother had shown me once long ago, when I was small enough to marvel at the secrecy. She had told me that sometimes survival depended not on being seen, but on knowing where others never looked. I stepped inside, the scent of dust and cedar wrapping around me. My heels clicked against stone, the sound muffled by thick silence. I closed the door behind me and stood in the dark, my breath steady. For the first time in years, I felt not erased but in control. From the corridor, I could hear faint echoes of the dinner above. The scrape of chairs, the clink of silverware, bursts of laughter. They believed they had humiliated me, buried me in silence once again. But they had no idea that silence was not my prison. It was my weapon. I moved forward through the narrow hallway, my hand brushing the cold wall for balance. Each step carried me deeper into memory, back to the girl who had once hidden here after being mocked for speaking too loudly at dinner. I remembered crouching in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration above, promising myself I would never cry where they could see. Tonight I kept that promise. The corridor opened into a small chamber where old furniture was stacked. Sheets draped over forgotten relics. I pulled one sheet back and revealed a wooden chest. Inside were records my mother had hidden away, files she had copied quietly over the years. Bank statements, contracts, letters. I had found them after her death, tucked away beneath old quilts. I had added my own pages since then, turning the chest into a vault of truth. I sat on the stone floor and opened the folder I carried. Inside was the email Charlotte had written, the proof of their intent to discard me. I placed it on top of the pile, a crown jewel of arrogance. Then I closed the chest and rested my hands on the lid. Upstairs, the music swelled, laughter spilling through the floorboards. Their perfect night unfolded above me. But down here, I held the pieces that would shatter it. Not with a scream, not with a fight, but with the quiet unlocking of a door and the patience to let silence do the rest. I leaned back against the wall, closed my eyes, and breathed deeply. The cold stone pressed against my spine, grounding me. I thought of every insult, every dismissal, every night I had walked away invisible. This time I would not walk away. The stage was set. The morning after the Christmas dinner dawned too bright for the weight I carried in my chest. Sunlight spilled across the snow in sharp reflections, dazzling to the point of pain. I stood by my apartment window with a cup of coffee cooling in my hand, staring at the frozen street below. My phone buzzed constantly on the table behind me. Calls from Michael, from Elaine, from numbers I did not recognize but knew were connected to them. I let it ring. Their desperation was not my emergency anymore. Instead, I sat down at my desk and opened the chest I had brought back from the estate. The old wooden box creaked as I lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and age rising like memory itself. Inside lay years of documents, a record my mother had begun and I had continued. I pulled out folder after folder, laying them across the desk until the surface was covered. Bank records, private emails, duplicates of contracts, evidence of mismanagement so blatant it was almost laughable. And on top, Charlotte's careless email, the one that had revealed their plan to discard me. I spread the pages out slowly, methodically, like setting the pieces of a puzzle into place. For years I had kept this collection as a shield, protection against being erased completely. Now for the first time I saw it not just as defense, but as a weapon. That afternoon I met Thomas Reed at his office. He looked tired, the weight of the Donovan chaos pressing even on him. He poured coffee, his hands steady, his eyes sharp. When I slid the folder across his desk, he did not speak right away. He flipped through the pages with quiet precision, pausing now and then to underline a line or circle a figure. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "Claire, this is enough to end Michael's reign 10 times over," he said. "Are you ready for what comes after?" I stared at the papers between us, the weight of them heavy even though they were just ink and paper. For so long I had lived in the shadow of their power. To imagine life beyond it felt almost impossible. But then I remembered my father's voice at the Christmas table, Elaine's laughter, Sophie's smirk. I remembered the decades of silence that had carved me into someone invisible. "Yes," I said, "I am ready." Thomas nodded slowly as though measuring the truth in my words. Then he told me what needed to happen next. Quiet conversations with board members, strategic leaks to the press, careful timing. If we moved too fast, they could spin it as betrayal. If we moved too slow, they would recover and bury me again. In the weeks that followed, I lived in a strange duality. By day, I appeared at my own office meeting with the founders I had supported, answering questions, reviewing contracts. They trusted me, respected me, looked at me as though my opinion mattered. By night, I sifted through the Donovan files, highlighting, organizing, preparing. Each document was a blade sharpened for the inevitable strike. Michael's calls grew more frantic. He left long voicemails, his voice breaking with desperation. "Claire, you do not understand. We are ruined if you do not help." He tried guilt, reminding me of childhood memories, as though a shared past could erase years of humiliation. Then he turned to threats, his voice hard, warning me that I would regret turning my back on family. I saved them all, each message another nail in the coffin of their performance. One evening, Elaine showed up at my apartment uninvited. She wore a fur coat, diamonds glittering at her ears, her perfume choking the small space the moment she walked in. She smiled, lips tight, eyes cold. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," she said, lowering herself onto my couch as though she owned it. "Sign the papers, play along, and we can all survive this." I stood by the window, the city glowing behind me, and looked at her. "Survive," I repeated softly. "That is all you want. But I want more than survival." Her eyes narrowed, her voice sharpened. "Do not be foolish, Claire. Without us, you are nothing." I turned fully, then my voice steady. "Without me, you would already be gone." For the first time in all the years I had known her, Elaine faltered. Her mouth opened, then closed again, no words coming. She stood abruptly clutching her coat and stormed out without another glance. I sat down after she left, my body trembling, but inside I felt a calm I had never known. Meanwhile, the cracks in the Donovan facade widened. Reporters caught wind of the failed Fairchild deal. Investors whispered about mismanagement. Employees began to update their resumes. The empire that had once seemed unshakable trembled with every headline. One night close to midnight, Sophie called me. Her voice was slurred, whether from drink or tears I could not tell. "Why are you doing this, Claire?" she asked, her words tumbling together. "We are your family, you cannot just walk away." I closed my eyes, the phone pressed to my ear. "Family," I whispered. "Family is supposed to protect you, not bury you." She sobbed, then muttering curses, and hung up. I set the phone down gently, staring at the city lights. For years I had dreamed of this moment, the day they would feel what I had felt all my life. The dismissal, the humiliation, the silence, and now it was here. But it was not joy that filled me, it was clear. The next board meeting arrived like a storm. Michael looked ragged, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, his voice hoarse from shouting. He tried to rally support, blaming me, accusing me of betrayal. He pointed at me across the table, his hand shaking, his words desperate. "She is tearing this family apart." I sat calmly, my folder open before me. I did not raise my voice, I did not argue. I simply slid one document after another across the table. Evidence of mismanagement, proof of lies, Charlotte's email. Each page landed like a stone, heavy and undeniable. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Michael and me. Silence filled the room. Finally, one of them cleared his throat and said what none of them had dared before. "Michael, this is indefensible." Michael shouted. Elaine pleaded. Sophie hissed insults under her breath, but the tide had already turned. The board had seen too much. I gathered my papers, slowly tucking them back into the folder. As I stood, I looked at Michael one last time. His face was red, his jaw clenched, his body trembling. He looked less like the golden boy my father had worshipped and more like a child caught in a lie. I walked out of the boardroom, the echo of my heels steady, deliberate. For years, I had been invisible, the quiet shadow in the background. Now I was the one holding the truth. The city air hit me like a blessing when I stepped outside, cold, sharp, alive. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight on my chest finally lift. Their empire was crumbling, and I had not lifted a sword. I had simply unlocked the door and let their own rot consume them. I stood there for a long moment, watching the lights flicker across skyscrapers, hearing the rush of traffic below. The night was alive, and for the first time in my life, I felt alive too. The end was not far now. The morning after this board meeting was quiet in a way that felt almost unreal. I woke before dawn, the sky outside still dark. The city hushed as though it too was holding its breath. For a moment I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar rush of dread that had followed me for years. It did not come. Instead, there was only stillness, a heavy calm pressing down on me. I rose slowly, wrapped myself in a sweater, and made coffee, the bitter scent filling my apartment. My phone sat on the counter, dark and silent. No calls from Michael. No messages from Elaine. No drunken pleas from Sophie. The silence was its own message. They knew the tide had turned. They knew I no longer belonged to their shadows. I opened my journal and wrote a single line across the top of the page. "The reckoning has arrived." Beneath it, I listed the names of everyone who had tried to bury me, then drew a line through each one. It was not about erasing them. It was about freeing myself from the hold they had over me. Later that morning, I walked through the Donovan building one last time. The lobby that had once intimidated me now felt smaller, almost ordinary. Assistants whispered as I passed, their eyes wide, their voices hushed. Some nodded discreetly, small acknowledgments that they had seen me all along, even if they had never dared to say it. The board convened again, though this time the energy was different. There was no shouting, no desperate persuasion. The chairperson read aloud the vote of no confidence. Michael was stripped of his title, effective immediately. Elaine and Sophie sat rigid, their faces masks of fury, their lips pressed thin. Michael's hands trembled on the table, his knuckles white, his voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. "You cannot do this to me." But it was already done. The papers were signed, the votes tallied, the decision final. He looked at me, then his eyes burning with hatred. But beneath it I saw something else. Fear. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply gathered my folder, stood, and walked out. Outside, the winter sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the city streets. I tilted my face toward it, letting the warmth touch my skin. For the first time in decades, I felt the chains of invisibility fall away. In the weeks that followed, the Donovan empire unraveled with astonishing speed. Reporters uncovered years of mismanagement, employees left in waves, creditors demanded repayment. The mansion that had once been the site of glittering galas was suddenly quiet, its windows dark. Elaine retreated to Florida, Sophie disappeared into Europe, and Michael was left to face the wreckage he had created. I did not chase them. I did not speak to them again. My revenge had never been about confrontation. It had been about unlocking the door they tried to bar me from and letting their own rot spill into the light. Instead, I focused on the life I had built quietly in the background. Harbor 12. Holdings expanded the companies I had backed flourishing. Ruth's business doubled in size. Ahmed's platform grew across states. Maya and Louis opened a second office. They invited me to ribbon cuttings, to late-night celebrations, to small dinners where laughter was real and trust was mutual. Each time I felt a warmth that no boardroom applause could ever match. One evening I sat in a cafe in Brooklyn, watching the founders I had supported raise a toast to their success. They looked at me not as an accessory to someone else's power, but as a partner and equal. I raised my glass too, my heart swelling with a kind of quiet joy I had once thought impossible. At home later that night, I opened my mother's jewelry box again. The brass key still lay inside, cool and familiar. I held it in my palm, thinking of the night I had unlocked the hidden corridor, the night everything shifted. My mother had left me more than protection. She had left me a path, a reminder that even in the darkest corners, there were doors waiting to be opened. I slipped the key back into the box and closed it gently. Some doors had already served their purpose. Others remained for the future. Now, when I think of family, I no longer think of the Donovans gathered around a table, their laughter cutting me into silence. I think of the people who chose me freely, who valued me for more than what I could rescue or hide. That is the family I carry now, the one I built with my own hands, in my own name. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not stepping into the spotlight sooner, if I wish I had fought louder, harder. The truth is no. Silence shaped me, taught me patience, taught me to see what others missed. It gave me the strength to wait until the right moment, and when that moment came, I was ready. And to you listening now, I will say this. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been told to sit quietly and serve like dirt, know this. Your silence is not your end. It can be your strength. It can be the space where you gather power, where you shape your own path. And when the time comes, you too can unlock the door that others tried to keep closed. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. I hope it reminded you that dignity cannot be erased, that justice comes in its own time, and that even the quietest voices can shake the foundations of an empire. Share your thoughts with me. Let me know if you have ever lived a moment where silence became your strength. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories of betrayal, of resilience, of revenge and transformation, do not forget to subscribe and stay with me. There are many more doors to unlock together.